Today we're going to be learning Yevamot Daf Ayin Vav. We're going to start off finishing up this topic of patzua, daka, and crut, shufcha. Okay, the beginning is going to be a little bit continuing with the graphic details, some a little worse than others. We are then going to, before we finish and close up, then we're going to get to patzua daka from a bit of a different perspective, who they can marry, who they can't marry. What about a patzua daka kohen? Is he permitted all of a sudden to marry the people that a kohen can't marry or not? And then I'm going to give a little bit of a summary and background to this whole idea, which is a little bit hard to understand, why this person who is a patzua daka or crut, shufcha, why they can't marry within the community. So we'll take a little break from the daf for a moment at that point when we're done to kind of give perspective on the whole thing. Okay, we're going to start from Amar Rav Huna Amar Shmuel at the top of our daf. Nikev v'nistam. Okay, so we talked about if you have a nekev, okay, there's some sort of laceration, there's some sort of perforation, a tear, v'nistam, and it was then closed up. Kol she'ilu, maybe laceration is the wrong word, but a perforation, like a real tear. So if there's a tear, v'nistam, and then it closed up, it healed. Kol she'ilu nikre v'nikra pasul, v'ilav kasher. What's the test to know? Well, if when he has a seminal emission, it then opens up again, because right, it's going to come out a little bit forcefully, it'll tear it. Well, if that's going to happen, then it's obviously really no good. But if not, then it's kasher, because the whole issue again is we want to make sure this person can have children. If it's going to leak out somewhere else, then it's not going to be able to work. Have about Rav. Rava asked the following question: where exactly are we talking about this nekev is? Hey, where? If it's by the very tip, we already said if it's cut off there, it's totally fine as long as you leave just a hair's breadth, right? Of there's a little bit still there. The ataratzma must mean right where the tip connects with the rest of it. So in that area, that's what we're talking about. This is tear. Itmar nami. This the following thing was said also, which is basically just verifying the things we just said a minute ago, which is it was also said Amar Rav Meri Amar Mar Amar Mar Ukva Amar Shmuel. So the same thing was said by Shmuel. Nikev ba'atara atzma v'nistam. It's a combination of both things. He talks about the location of it and he talks about how it heals. And as long as it heals in the way that Carrie wouldn't come out, wouldn't drip out, and kind of tear it again, then it's fine. Shalach le Rabba berei de Rabba le Rav Yosef. Okay, Rabba, the son of Rabba, says to Rav Yosef the following question. Yilamdenu Rabbeinu, hechi avdina. So now he says, okay, now we're going to get a little more graphic. How do we figure, what do we do? How do we figure out whether if he has a seminal emission, it's going to tear again? So basically you have to do like a procedure, okay? So this is going to sound a little strange. On the other hand, in light of people who do all sorts of, I'll think of the words in Hebrew, but when you're having trouble having children and you have to go and, there's basically different methods of trying to resolve the issues. So sometimes a guy has to go into a room and have a seminal emission. So here the rabbis are describing, how do we get this person to have a seminal emission? We're going to have a bit of an interesting discussion about it, however uncomfortable it might make us to have this discussion. So, Yilamdenu Rabbeinu Hechev Dina, what do we do? Amarle, Maitina Nahama Chamima, Disare. Okay, we're going to remember this barley. Somehow barley seems to be a theme. Take hot barley bread. You put it right there on the man's body. The heat is going to cause the man to have a seminal emission, and that's when we'll be able to tell whether it's going to tear again or not. To which the Gemara has an interesting response. Is everyone so pristine like Yaakov Avinu that you have to go so far as to bring hot bread there, and that if you don't bring hot bread, you're not going to be able to get him to do that? Now, what was Yaakov Avinu? What do we know about Yaakov about this? Well, he said about Reuven, you're my koach, my strength, and the first of my oni. So what do they explain this to be? Okay, you basically, the first time I ever had a seminal emission was when that led to your birth. So basically, you're going to say, what? Everyone's like Yaakov Avinu, it's going to be so difficult to get them to do this. You have to bring this hot bread, to which they say, Elam or Abai. So Abai says, no, don't do that. He says, bring nice women's clothing, and that will make him think of a woman, and that will cause him to be able to have the seminal emission. So, Amarava, what you think just looking at clothes is going to cause the man to have a seminal emission? What is everyone like Barzilai Giladi who, based on some drashot in the psukim, was known to be, or based on the rabbis, have a drashah. This doesn't come up in the text, but the rabbis are something to say he was a guy who liked to sleep around. So is everyone like that just seeing women's clothing is going to make them have some mission? And therefore, they say, let's go back to the bread. And because there's some, right, in the end, maybe a better interpretation is some people like that, some people like that. So do something that will be a sure thing. Okay, interesting discussion. We will move on. Tanu Rabbanit, Nikev pasul mipnei shu shotet. So now we're still talking about there's a crack there, or some sort of perforation. He's disqualified because shotet, right? Because it's dripping out rather than coming out strongly. Nistam kasher mipnei shu moli. But as long as it heals, then it's fine. V'zeu pasul shechozer lehechshiro. This is an example of someone who can be disqualified, but can then become qualified again, okay? Because it could heal. So now the Gemara says, like this is a braita. The braita says, this is a case, which sounds like there's other cases that you could have some sort of perforation. We're going to switch topics entirely for a moment. And it wouldn't be able to go back to being okay. What would this be? Now we're talking about an animal that's a treifa. But we like to use the word treif very generally. Treif means not kosher. But that's not really what treif means. Treifa, which comes from the treifa, is an animal that's sick, has some sort of injury in its body. One of the things is there's a hole in the lungs. There's a hole in the lungs, a tear in the lungs. That's basically going to make the animal a treifa. And now they're going to compare this to the tear that we were talking about in the man's body, because the tear in the man's body can be healed. Or if it heals, then it goes back to normal. But this kind of tear, not. So if a membrane develops there and blocks the tear, it's still a treifa. Okay, we don't allow that animal to be, again, what does it mean? It means even if you had a kosher slaughtering, it wouldn't allow the animal to be eaten. Back to our topic. It was nice to get diverted for a minute, but we're back to our topic and have more. This is okay. Of all the things, this is probably the craziest. So prepare yourselves. But I will thank the Kohen and the Steinsaltz for having an excellent footnote about this to put these things in perspective. So if you have it in front of you, you can take a sneak peek, or you can just wait and I'll explain it. So how do we resolve this problem? Someone has a tear. How do we help it to heal so that it will be eventually this person will not be a patzua daka and will be allowed to marry anyone he wants? So netina sa'arta, we get back to this barley. You take a pearl of barley, and you scratch the area right around where the tear is. Why would you do this? Well, it starts to bleed and then you'll start to scab. Okay, once it starts to scab, netina tarba v'shayfina, and you put this like a fatty substance on it, and you rub it around. Umaytinan shumshana gamla. This is the weird part. Umaktinale. Okay, you bring an ant, and the ant basically starts nibbling at it, and then it because of the fat, it gets stuck there. Upaskinan le'lereshe, and you cut off its head, and that resolves it. Because what happens? Okay, and this is what the Steinsaltz explained very beautifully. At least helpful, I don't know, beautiful, but that people in those days used ants to basically like stitches, okay? Because the ants would eat kind of at both sides and bring it together, okay? And this was some method that was used back in the ancient world. So once you understand that, you could see why they would say this, right? Because we obviously would never do this in a million years. But apparently this was a method that was used, so that actually helps. And Emma is saying that ants are still used as stitches in some places. That's very interesting. Anyway, I don't want to think about that too much. So in any case, this is how they would do it. And then they're pointing out, which is fascinating, right? Dafka sa'arta, specifically barley. Aval parzela mizraf zarif. It's all about infection, right? They said use barley. Don't use a metal utensil because that will cause infection, right? This we know. So anyway, they thought that barley, again, I've never tried it, but that it was more sterile basically. And if you start using a metal, that might cause infection. This is all true. Katan, aval gadol, mikfule mikpal. But a big tear is not going to be fixed in this way. Okay, this won't work. That's just going to open up again. We're only talking about small tears. Okay, so you've learned a little bit about ancient medicine today, which at least if you can view it in light of that, becomes interesting. So now, last part for this uncomfortable part, then we'll get more to basic, more simpler things, and maybe more interesting, maybe not, you decide. Amar Rabba bar Rav Huna, matil mayim mishtei makomot pasul. Rabba bar Rav Huna says, if when the man urinates, comes out from two different holes, that again shows there's obviously a hole there and, a problem, and that's going to cause him to be a patzua daka. Amar Rava, leitil chata lo kivra velo ka'aba. Rava says, I don't paskin. The halacha is not like the son and not like the father. So the son is who we just said, okay? Bra hada amaran, that's Rabba bar Rav Huna. He doesn't hold like him. If you urinate and it comes out from two holes, it disqualifies you. You're not considered a patzua daka or crut shufcha. And Abba de Amar Rav Huna, nashim hamisolelot zo bazo psulot l'kiuna. Women who engage in a sexual interaction with another woman is disqualified for marrying a kohen. She's already in the category of what we call a zonah. That's Rav Huna. Rava says, I don't agree with him. And Rava says, even if you go by Rabbi Elazar, remember he had the widest definition of zonah, where anyone engaging in a sexual relationship outside of marriage is going to be a zonah, even though many people disagree with him. Even according to him, that's only male and female. But if it's a woman with another woman, that's just pritsut, he says. That's not, right? It's not considered technically a sexual encounter, even if you might call it a sexual encounter, that's not. And therefore, the woman is not pasul l'kiuna against what Rav Huna says. That's an interesting topic in and of itself, but we're not going to delve into it much more than that. Okay, new Mishnah. Patzua daka or crut shufcha. We're still on the topic, but a bit of a different perspective. Mutarim b'giyored u'shochet. So we're done with defining what constitutes this. How do you heal it? All that. Now we're going to get back to who can they marry. So they can marry anyone who's not b'kal Hashem, because they can't come b'kal Hashem. That means they can't marry a regular kohen at yisrael, but they can marry a woman who converted and mishocheret. If you remember, those two women are kind of in between. They can marry people who are part of the community other than a kohen, but they can't, and they can also marry the people who are not allowed to marry, like mamzer and netin, all those people that are not allowed to vote b'kal Hashem, they can marry the gior and mishcheret. So this patzua daka is on the other side, right, of the people who can't marry within the community, but they can marry those women. Okay, so they're only forbidden from coming into the community, meaning marrying a kohen at yisrael. Because it says they can't come into Kal Hashem. So again, right, the Gior and Meshacheret are kind of in between. They're both, okay? They work in both categories. So comes Rav Sheshet with the question, which we're going to deal with for a while. They asked Rav Sheshet, patzua daka kohen. He's a kohen, but he's a patzua daka. So a kohen can't marry a gior and a mishcheret. But can a patzua daka kohen marry a gior and mishcheret? We talked about this before. We talked about this case where someone had undergone chemotherapy and they were kohen and they wanted to marry a giored, and was it allowed or not, right? So there was a debate about it. So patzua daka kohen ma'u b'gior and mishcheret b'kedushatei kai v'asil o dilma la b'kedushatei kai v'shavei. Okay, the question there with the chemotherapy wasn't, is it allowed or not if he was a patzua daka? The question was, do we call him a patzua daka or not, right? And that was the concern. They didn't want to open a Pandora's box and just claim all people who went through chemotherapy and can no longer have children as a result of that, right? Not everyone who went through chemotherapy, but anyone who went through chemotherapy and can't have children. Does that put them in the category of patzua daka or not? That would be kind of creating a huge problem, even though it might help this kohen, it would create a problem for other people. So the question is, can you just say, we're saying it just for this case, not in general, or are you basically creating a precedent, which will be a dangerous precedent? But we're going to see that the halacha is, if you are for sure patzua daka kohen, then you can marry a gioret. Okay, so right now we're in the question now. So do we say he has sanctity like a kohen and therefore would be forbidden, or do we say no, a patzua daka already loses his sanctity as a kohen and therefore is permitted? Amalei Rav Sheshet. Tanitua, let's learn it from the following bright. Patzua daka yisrael mutar b'netina. Okay, patzua daka who's a yisrael can marry a netina. What's a netina? Netina are from the Givonim. They were, time of Yoshua, they tricked the Jews. They were part of the Sheva Amim that we weren't allowed to create a brit with, right, a covenant, and we couldn't marry their children. because the 7 nations were forbidden. Lo titchaten bam. We're going to see this soon. Anyone from the 7 nations are forbidden, even if they convert. Okay, we're going to talk about what's d'oraita, what's d'Rabbanan, etc. We'll get back to that. But the netinim basically tricked them to say that they were people from far away, but they really weren't. They were really part of the 7 nations. And then we'll see later, a few dapim, that David forbade us to marry them, which a little bit is going to maybe contradict some understandings of our sugya, but anyway, we'll go forward still right now. So a patzua daka yisrael can marry a netina. Netina is generally someone who cannot marry into the Jewish people. So the patzua daka yisrael can marry. So what do you see here? If you want to say b'kedusha teka, he's still in his sanctity, the Yisrael, patzua daka, it says you can't marry them, right? And the netina is part of that because they're part of the 7 nations. And therefore, it must be la b'kedusha teka, and that's how we override this Torah halacha. And then we make the analogy to the kohen, just like a patzua Yisrael, right? So this is the issue, Gita. Exactly what you're saying. There's a bit of an issue. How can it be d'Rabbanan? How can it be d'oraita? We're going to see that there's an exact debate about this, whether it's d'oraita, whether it's d'Rabbanan. And the second option, which is going to say it's actually forbidden by Torah law, is going to have an issue with that thing about the David forbade it. Okay, so it's a little bit confusing. That's why I kind of mentioned it without getting too much into detail. But now, we basically are going to say, patzua daka Yisrael is permitted to a netina because they're not b'kedusha tei, and therefore it overrides the Torah law of lo titchaten bam. Likewise, patzua daka kohen can marry a gioret because la b'kedusha teka. Okay, we're going to make that analogy. Amar Rava, atu hata mishum kedusha v'la b'kedusha. Are you saying it's because patzua daka Yisrael can marry a netina because he's not kadosh anymore, and therefore it overrides the Torah law? No, it's not even a Torah law. Okay. Dilma, what's the issue? But why lo titchaten? Who can't you marry? Now, there's a debate here. Is you can't marry anyone from the 7 nations when they're Gentiles, like without conversion, and that's what we seem to say. And the netinim converted, okay? They converted as a group, but we're not allowed to marry them because they're part of Sheva Ami. Okay, so the question is it for converts, lo titchaten bam, or is it for non-converts? So what they're going to say is, obviously, the Torah law, lo titchaten bam, is when they're Gentiles, okay? Because why? What's the whole reason? The whole concern is, if you marry a Gentile, you'll end up having a child, probably, and then your child will be growing up in this Gentile environment, and they'll end up worshiping, right, in this idol-worshiping environment. That's what was going on at the time. They'll end up worshiping idols. As soon as they convert, anyone from the Sheva Ami, they're permitted all of a sudden to Yisrael. Comes in David HaMelech, and he says, the netinim, no. Even though other converts from the Sheva Ami we can, these people no. But now here comes an Gzeira. Who's it apply to and who doesn't it apply to? So, what was the whole reason for the Torah prohibition? Because you'll have children and your children will go worship idols. But if you can't have children because you're patzua daka, so when the rabbis instituted their gzera on the people, even when they converted, because maybe since they have background of Gentiles, maybe you're worried the netinim will, and also it's not exactly the reason, but it was instituted similar to the Torah halacha. And since the Torah halacha was all because you might end up having children that will be turned away, well, a person who can't have children is just not part of that gzera. Okay, in a minute, we're going to reject this, but that's right now what Rava thinks. Then they say, wait, wait a minute. So you're going to say the netim can marry people who can't have children, but can't marry people then who can have children. So how, if the whole concern is ultimately maybe they'll divert you to worship their gods, even though they've converted, right? There's not really such a chance, but it's a gzeira, right, for the main halacha, which is based on that. So now we're going to say anyone who can have children then shouldn't be able to marry them. So a mamzer, who's a Jew, basically, they're just can't marry within the community. A mamzer shouldn't be allowed to marry a netina. Why? Because they'll have children, and the problem will be the mamzerim are still Jewish. They have to keep Jewish law. They can't go worship idols, right? They just have an issue with marriage. But so Mamzerim should be forbidden. They are permitted to marry each other. So he rejects, okay, Rava changes what he said. It's not because they can have children or can't have children, and that's what determines. The rabbis made a gzera only when David Melech came and said netinim can't lavo b'kahal, they can't come within the community. He made it only for people who were sherim in the community and not for psulim. Two reasons I saw given. One is you don't make a gzera on something that's very uncommon. And it's very uncommon to be a mamzer or one of these psulei kahal, patzua, daka, etc. And therefore, the gzera just didn't apply to rare circumstances. That's a very common rule. When the rabbis make a gzera, it doesn't apply to rare cases. Number two option is to say that David did it because the people were not rachmanim. Okay, they weren't merciful people. And because of that, he didn't want them as part of the Jewish community. But if they marry people who are not anyway permitted to marry into the Jewish community, then it's not exactly marrying, right? It won't affect the community as a whole. So therefore, maybe it's just not relevant to people who can't marry in. Again, this whole concept of people not being married in is a big issue. I'm just not delving into it right now. But, to say they're not really part of the community is kind of difficult. But leave that aside. Hadar Amar Rav. Okay, now this was all just to be clear, because it's a little bit of a confusing statement. Rav Sheshet came along and said, patzua daka kohen is mutar, permitted to marry a gioret or a convert or a maidservant who was free, which means she's Jewish now. Why? Because just like a patzua daka yisrael can marry a netina, patzua daka kohen can marry, they're not b'kedushatam. And therefore, right, comes Rava and says, I know what you're talking about. Lo titchatem bam is only a gzera de Rabbanit. That's why the yisrael can marry the netina. But the kohen is asher midoraita. You can't just override that and allow him, because he's a patzua daka, to marry gioret and meshuperet, because his whole basis is the yisrael to the netina is only de Rabbanit. Lo titchatem bam means when they're Gentiles. The netinim converted, and therefore it's only rabbinic. Rava now is going to reject what he said and switch gears and say, and this is why I said before, it's a little confusing with David Melech, and this one's going to be a little confusing with the fact that David forbade the netinim, because now he's going to say that anyone from the Sheva Amim who converted that's what the word lo titchatem bam is referring to. It's referring to converts, which would then include netinim, and it's forbidden on a Torah level, which would then reinstate Rav Sheshet's answer. Because then, just like patzua daka yisrael can marry a netina, even though it's theoretically forbidden by Torah law, because he's a patzua daka, he's not b'kedushato anymore, right? His sanctity is gone. Likewise, for the kohen, patzua daka can marry anyone who a kohen really wasn't permitted to marry in the first place. So that's what we're going to read right now. Hadarama Rava lav miltahi. It's not true what I said. Biotan of de kochavim leitlu chatanut. Nitgairu ilu chatanut. His whole proof now is based on what we've talked about many times. Kiddushin tovsim or ain't kiddushin tovsim. Remember, sometimes you can marry someone and it's not even considered a marriage, like a Jew and a Gentile. It's not a marriage at all. If you do it, it's not marriage. So you're not an Eshadish, let's say, if you're a woman who marries a Gentile, you're not a married woman. So if you end up in a relationship with somebody else, you don't get the death penalty. Okay? It's not considered adultery because the marriage is invalid. So they say, if it says lo titchatem bam, comes Rabba, don't marry them. It would have to be don't marry them in a situation where marriage would be valid. If they're Gentiles, the marriage is invalid. So the language, litchatem, can only be applying to a case where your actual marriage would have been a marriage. So that means it must be referring to when they convert. Because if they convert, then you can marry. Right? If you marry them, the marriage is valid. And yet the Torah is telling you, don't do that. Okay? So, Matziv Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef says, wait a minute. You can't use the language of marriage always means that the kiddushin are tofsim. I'm going to prove to you it's not. It actually doesn't say bat Paro, at Paro Melech Mitzrayim, right? He married Paro, the king of Egypt, which means he married Paro's daughter, right? He made one of these marriage relationships between kings. So there you see marriage with a Gentile and a Jew getting married, which you just said a minute ago, Hitchatnut wouldn't be referring to that. Here we see it does. So Giyurei Gaira. No, he converted her. Okay, she converted to Judaism. What do you mean she converted to Judaism? Remember, we had all the discussions about Gerim, and we said they didn't accept converts in those days. Why? So these people were converting because things were so good for the Jewish people. There was wealth and everything. So people converted for the wrong reasons, ulterior motives. So they say, that's why it can't be he really married Pharoah. If she was Gentile, she must have converted. To which the Gemara says, what are you talking about? Why didn't they accept Gerim in the time of Shlomo and David? Midu tama ela l'shulchan malachim, turning now to Amabet. Is it not because people wanted to marry into the Jewish people and have the good life? Well, tepukle, halot srichale. She clearly didn't need that. She came from the daughter of Paro. She had enough wealth. She definitely didn't need Shlomo HaMelech's wealth. So therefore, he could have converted her, okay? Because even though they didn't generally accept converts, she would have been a convert that was accepted. Let's not talk about, unfair for leaders to do things that the people can't do, but theoretically, we could say maybe he did convert her. But they say, no, even though she still was forbidden to him because she was a first generation Mitzri convert. You can't marry people like that. If you say maybe the Egyptians from the Torah are not the Egyptians in those times, right? The people living in Egypt in the time of the Exodus, which is when the whole thing came in, don't marry a Mitzri, those people already left the land, and there were other people who came in, and it's not the same nation. And maybe the Mitzrim of today, meaning of the time of Shlomo, were not the same as the Mitzrim then. And that's why he was allowed to marry her. Well, Rabbi Yehuda says, he was a student of Rabbi Akiva, and he said, I have a friend, student of Rabbi Akiva, whose name is Minyamin, and he's a convert, an Egyptian convert. Amal, ani mitzri rishon. So my friend Minyamin said to me the following, or said in general the following. Ani mitzri rishon. I'm a first generation mitzri. Remember, third generation mitzri, Egyptian, can marry Ineret. So what is he going to do? He says, Nasati mitzri rishona. Who did I marry? Because he can't marry anybody. He found another Egyptian convert just like him and married her. Asir lebini, I'm going to marry my son off to a mitzri shnia, to a second generation Egyptian. So that they will be second generation and their children will be third generation and they can already marry. That's how I'm going to rectify the situation. So now what do you see here? In the time of the Gemara, right, or the Mishnah actually, in the time of the Mishnah, the Egyptians were still the same Egyptians because the same issue applied of the Ger Mitzri. So obviously in the time of Shlomo it applied. So again, if Rava is going to say lo titchatem bam has to be a marriage that has validity, well, in Shlomo's time, the word, right, in Sefer Shmuel, the word, or Sefer Malachim, I guess it is, the word vayitchaten is not relevant, right? Can't mean nisuin because she was either a Gentile or she was a convert who wasn't permitted. So how do you explain that? Amar Papa, thank you, yeah, Malachim Aleph. Amar Papa, Ana mishlomo leker b'neitov. Wait, you're going to try to question this from Shlomo HaMelech? Shlomo lo nasi midi. He didn't marry her at all. It wasn't even a marriage. Lo vayitchaten doesn't actually mean he married her. How do we know this? This is a description in Sefer Melachim of things that were going on in the time of Shlomo. He married all these other women. Remember, he's with all these other women. So it says, it's actually a little difficult because the pasuk after really said he married 700 women, I think it was, or something, some crazy number. But here it says, from all these women who God had, from all these nations that God had said, don't marry, right? Don't have relations. Notice it doesn't say marry. Lo tavo bahem vehem lo yavo bachem, which means don't engage in relations with them. Right? They'll turn your heart away from God. Bahem davak shlomo la'ahava. To these people, Shlomo stuck to love them, meaning he just had relationships with them. So when it says he married her, he didn't really marry her. Ela kasha vayitchatem. So the Gemara says, but it says he married her. How can you say he didn't marry her? Mitoch ava yiterash ahava, because he loved her so much. Ma'ala alav katuv ki'ilu nitchatem. Okay, so it made it as if he married her, but he didn't really marry her. In which case, that doesn't raise a question to our pasuk of lo titchatem bam. Lo titchatem bam would have to be when she's a convert, because it would have to be a case where the kiddushin would be valid, and that makes the netinim forbidden by Torah law, which means that just like the patzua daka can marry the netina, patzua daka kohen can marry a gior or a shufcha. That's what we were trying to prove. Okay, whether this is convincing or not, I see someone wrote, it sounds like apologetics. Yes. I mean, this is classic of our argument where they have a problem with something and they just kind of put it aside somehow by coming up with a creative explanation. Does this mean the rabbis all believe that Shlomo HaMelech didn't marry Pharoah? Not necessarily. This is just in a line of argument. They try to say not every time it says vayitchaten, it actually means there was a full marriage. It's just trying to answer a question against them. Whether it really means that this is what they believe was truth or not is a separate question. Amalei Ravina LeRavashi, last part about this. And then we'll move on to Amon and Moav after I give a bit of a background about patzua daka in general. Ravina says to Ravashi, patzua daka crut shufcha mutarim b'gior v'shucheret netina asire. Wait a minute. That Braita that said, there was the whole basis of Rav Sheshet's argument, that a netina can marry a patzua daka yisrael. How so? From our Mishnah it says, patzua daka can only marry gior v'shucheret. It doesn't mention netina. So they say, right, it would sound like not a netina. To which they say, no, Amalei, the litamech. Wait, Rav Ashi says back to Ravina, according to you, how do you understand the last line of the Mishnah? They're only forbidden to marry someone within the community, which would mean they can marry a netina. So, netina shavu, right? It would be permitted. So, you can't actually derive from the words of the Gemara. The Mishnah, it goes both ways. So, in the end, we seem to say, and that's why I said we in the end paskin like Rav Sheshet and like Rava eventually says, which is patzua daka yisrael can marry anybody. And then that would infer patzua kohen. A patzua daka kohen could also marry a woman who can't marry within the kila, right? He's not b'kedusha anymore. Can marry a convert, for example. But as I said, this question of chemotherapy, whether you define him as a patzua daka, is a whole separate question. Okay, let's just talk about patzua daka in general. So one thing we saw is that patzua daka in yesterday's daf is only bidei adam and not bidei shamayim. The Yerushalmi actually has a machloket about it, whether even if you're born a patzua daka, would that disqualify you? The question is, and this is really the issue between those two opinions, is it because you're not capable of having children, or is it a punishment? And why is it a punishment? Well, if it's done by man, now done by man could mean one of two things. You did it to yourself, or you got injured in some accident or something. But if you go with, you did it to yourself, the Sefer Chinuch puts it in the context of srisim, right? You know from the Megillah, for example, right? There was sarisei hamelech. The kings in those days, again, if you use his history to understand, it makes a lot of sense. The kings in those days would often castrate people so that they wouldn't have desires for women and they'd be loyal servants and they wouldn't get married. And that's not a Jewish concept. And therefore, in order to make sure that Jews understand that this is totally not acceptable, because to do that for sure is a problem, then they said, you can't marry in if you do this, right? It was a way to prevent people from taking action to do this for whatever reason, whether it's they wanted to have marriages without bearing children, right? They didn't want the responsibility of children, or they didn't want to deal with it. So that's also something that we don't believe in. So because of that, they forbade these people, right? That's the Sefer Chinuch's response. Rav Uziel, he had a good article about it, Rav Uziel, and he said maybe in addition to that, you could say it was a way to prevent znut. In other words, they didn't want people sleeping around just for the sake of having relations rather than for the purposes of also giving birth to children. And there was also an article in Pnei Halacha where he quoted, I didn't read it inside, but he quoted from the Moreh Nevuchim. And so again, I didn't see it inside, and maybe I misread that. I don't want to say it's definitely in the Moreh Nevuchim, just so that in case, since I didn't see it myself, but he said, it's also an issue because the patzua daka can't fulfill his mitzvah of ona properly. And it might cause his wife, don't marry someone within the community, because you might cause, it doesn't really explain why you can marry someone without the community, but why in general they're not allowed to marry is because we're worried that the wife will not get what she needs and therefore go commit adultery with somebody else. So it also it's like grounds for it's the basis for a bad relationship down the road. So possibly for that reason. So there's a bunch of different reasons given. Most of the poskim hold like the Bavli, that it's only if it's by man and not if you were born that way. And then you wouldn't be forbidden to Labobakal, but there are those who hold by that other opinion, the Yerushalmi, or at least go somewhat in that direction. But for the most part, it's understood more as something man-inflicted, and then you can understand the concept a little bit better as we describe now. Okay, new Mishnah. And now we're going to get into a good Tanakh shiur, a drasha on psukim and Sefer Shmuel. So I got confused with Shmuel before when I said when it was Malachim, but we're going to get into the story of Goliath and David and a whole interaction that went on there with some two psukim that are a little bit unclear what exactly is going on. And the Gemara is going to build a whole story about it. Mishnah, Amoni and Moavi asurim b'isuran isur olam. Aval nekevotehem mutarot miyad. So Amoni and Moavi, right, a convert from Amon, a convert from Moav can never, ever, right, 10th generation, 12th, it doesn't matter. They can never marry. So if you're Tzatzaim or Amoni or Moavi, and we're going to see soon why, because the Torah says, you went through their land and they didn't give you bread and water. And because of that, we don't want people like this, marrying within the community, even if they convert. Ava, right, which is difficult to accept. I accept that, right? Not so easy to say, oh, what? No one can ever do tshuva and they come and they convert to Judaism. You're not going to accept them, right? It's difficult putting it out there. Which you see, by the way, the rabbis tried to come up, and this whole thing is all about this, tried to come up with lessening, right? Okay, it's not 100% of the people, it's only 50% of the people. We'll let the females marry. So now, and this is a famous drasha, Amoni v'lo Amoni, Moavi v'lo Moavit. Obviously, yes, exactly as Debbie said, this is all preparation for Shavuot. Okay, we're moving in, right? Ruth HaMoaviyah ends up marrying Boaz, and right, famous story, and this is really where it comes up, and that's where we're going to talk about David, who was one of her, right, grandchildren. So now they say, Mitzri ve'edomi, what about them? So Mitzri ve'edomi can't come in for the first two generations, third generation already can marry. So what about them? Is it just male or also females? Mitzri ve'edomi enam asurim ela ad shlosha dorot. Okay, so only for 3 generations, male or female. Rabbi Shimon matir tenekevot miyad. Rabbi Shimon says the females can marry immediately, just like the Amon and Moav, the Ammoniot and Moaviot. So Amar Rabbi Shimon, kavachomer advarim. It's an obvious kavachomer. Man b'makom she'asaret haZcharim isur olam. When the Zcharim, the males can't marry forever, and yet he tirat tenekevot miyad. They permitted the women immediately. Makom shelo asaret haZcharim el ad shlosha dorot. When they only forbade for 3 generations, it's obviously much more lenient. Obviously, in Odin, to which the rabbis respond and say, Amarle, if you said it based on a tradition that you have, we'll accept it. But if you're coming up with your own kavachomer, we can knock it out. If that kavachomer is something you made up, we have a question on that, which we're not going to see today. We'll see only later. Amar lahem, lo ki alachani omer. He says, no, I have a tradition about this. So it sounds like, right, they accepted his position. So now, although not necessarily, but that's the way the Mishnah looks like. Now the Gemara is going to get into Menani. Now we really want to deal right now. We'll get back to the Mitzri and Edomi, but we want to deal with the Amon and Moav, the Ammonit and the Moavit. Where do we get this from? Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Damalcha. Okay, so we're at the David and Goliath battlefield. Remember, nobody's willing to go up against Goliath, and David Amelech comes forward. I will do it. Right. So first we have Vayabesh Shaul David Madav. Shaul gives David his clothing. Right, he puts all the garb on. He even gives him his own cloak. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then it says, I'm in chapter 17 of Shmuel Aleph, pasuk 55. When Shaul saw David Yotzei Lekata Plishti, okay, Amar al Avner Sartzava. He turns to Avner as Sartzava. Ben Mize Hanal Avner. Son of who is this person? Avner, right? Avner was his war head of the army. Vayomer Avner, Chenav Shecha Melech in Yadati. So Avner says, these are the psukim. I don't know. Okay. Now the next pasuk is a little bit strange, or not necessarily. Okay. In the world of Joshua, it's a little strange. Vayomer Hamelech Sha'alata ben Mize Ha'el. So basically, he says, who is this? He says, I don't know. And then Shaul says, go ask around, which actually sounds reasonable. But on the other hand, Shaul already asked. It's obvious to Avner, he should go ask, right? The king asks you something. Why is this repeated? And number 2, if you notice, he changes one important word. He calls him a na'ar, and then he calls him an elim. Now, those are what we call milim nerdmafot. They're synonyms. But it's a little bit weird. Why did he change it? Okay, go look into who is this elim. So we're going to darshan that soon. So the question is, first question asked is, V'lo yadale? Okay, wait a minute. Shaul did know who David was? Of course he knew. But in the chapter before, it says he loved David and he made him his nosei kelim, the guy who held his weapons for him. So of course he knew who David was. Wait, he said ben mi. He wanted to know who his father was. That's also not a good question. He didn't know his father. When it introduces Yishai, it says he was an important person. Okay, well, first of all, the pshat of the pasuk is it's Yishai. That's obvious. I'm not going to read you the pasuk, but it's clear because it starts with Yishai. But the drasha that Rav or maybe Rabbi Abba is saying is, what does it mean, Baba Anashim? It means right? You know, the way the president goes with cars and, you know, everybody escorting him. Also, when Yishai walked, there were people escorting him. That's what it means, Baba Anashim. So there's no way Shaul HaMelech didn't know Yishai. So that wasn't what he was asking. So now to say Hachi Kamar Shaul, what Shaul wanted to know was, he wanted to know, is this guy a threat to my kingdom? Hachi Kamar. I know he comes from Yehuda. Well, does he come from Peretz or Zerach? If he comes from Peretz, right? Which one? It's a sign he's going to be the king. Why? He darshans the name. The way of a king is to basically chart his own path, right? He can push through anything he wants and get whatever he wants done because he's the king. So Peretz is a name that leads to kingdom. Look, it's clear this guy's going to be an important person, but he'll just be an important person, nothing more. So he wanted to know, is he a threat? Now, my time, so why was he so nervous about David taking over? What I showed you before, he gave him his clothes. Madav, they darshan to say midato, his size. Now, what meant was when he put his clothes, miraculously, they fit David perfectly. Now, how do we know it was a miracle? We know he was taller than everybody else. So if his clothes fit David perfectly, there must have been a miracle. And then that got Shaul nervous. Now, you have to remember, clothes in the Torah is always significant of, right? First of all, in the book of Kings all the time, right? They tear the clothes as a sign, I'm tearing the kingdom from you. The clothes are always a sign, right? And also in the Megillah, right? The clothes in Yosef, there's all these references to clothes. Anyway, okay. So Amar Doeg Hadomi. In comes Doeg Hadomi. Now he's not here in the parsha. Okay, there's Avner, but in the Midrash world, Doeg Hadomi who's known to be the advisor of Shaul, who in the end ends up with this problem with Nov Ira Kohanim. I'm not going to get into that whole story, but he's known as the halachic advisor of Shaul in the Gemara. So he comes and says, you're asking about him now. Here's going to come why there were two questions that Shaul asked, because he was actually asking different questions. Right now, we've still been on the first question. Who's his father? Does he come from Peretz? Is he going to take over the kingdom? So it comes, right? This is a political appointee. What does people immediately start to do? Dig into their past and say, well, we don't want this guy appointed. Let's come up with something he did in his past that's going to disqualify him. Exactly that. So what does he say? You got the wrong question. He might not even be able to marry within the community because look at Ruth HaMoaviyah. My time, that's his ground, right? I forget exactly how many generations, but great-grandmother. Amon Avner. Tanina, so Avner comes in and says, I know what you're talking about. Amoni v'lo Amonit, Moavi v'lo Moavit. There you have it, right? She can marry. She was fine. Elameata, so comes Doeg Hadomi and says, well, if you're going to say it only applies to males and not females, you're going to say female mamzerim can marry in. You're going to take everything so literally, zachar, not keva. So mamzer, so comes, right? We have this ping pong. Comes up in here and says mamzer ktiv mumzal. Mamzer just means you have some blemish. Men have blemishes, women have blemishes, right? The mamzer blemish is a blemish on both. By the way, one of the proofs for the crut, the patzua daka crut being man-made is from the mamzer, right? We saw that in the Gemara before, because a mamzer is something you caused, right? Also you caused, not okay. Anyway, that's just a side. Mitzri v'lo mitzrit. So what about the mitzri? What you're going to say, mitzri v'lo mitzrit? He says, no, that's different. In by Amon and Moav, it says, now, who didn't do that? The men. Who goes out, right? The women are in the house. The men are the ones who were supposed to bring the water and the bread. It's funny, you always think of the women serving, but when it's out of your house and the Jews are coming through the town, it would be more appropriate that the men would do it. So comes Avner and says, what are you talking about? We're now at, right? Avner was trying to prove it's just the men, not the women. Comes Doeg and says, what are you talking about? Comes Doeg and has the last line. He says, no, the women were also responsible. They should have brought to the women, the men to the men, the women to the women, and therefore includes the women as well. Ishtik. He was silent. He didn't know what to say. Miyad, that's when in comes Shaul's second question. After this whole thing ensues, comes and he says, Vayomer HaMelech sha'al ata b'miza ha'elem. Why ha'elem? Hatam kari le'nar, hacha kari le'elem. Why elem? Hachi ka'amar halacha nitalma mimcha tseu sha'al b'beit midrash. Elem milashon litalem, to disappear, or not to be known. He said, this halacha is not known right now because I have Avner saying one thing and I have Doeg and we saying the other, and I don't know which one's right. Bring this to the Beit Midrash. Right? They're on the battlefield having this argument. He says, you got to take this to the Beit Midrash and ask some other people. Sha'al, okay, so they go and they ask, Amrule, Amoni v'lo Moavit, Amoni v'lo, right, you know the end of the story. Amoni v'lo Amonit, Moavi v'lo Moavit. So the Beit Midrash, they say, this is the case. We're not yet done because we're going to go back and we're going to say that in the Beit Midrash, Doeg asked all his questions, right? Because in the end, he ended up in the argument with Avner. He was at the top. So we'll have to wait till tomorrow to continue, even though you do know the end of the story here. But anyway, good, interesting story and nice way to end our daf. Have a Shavua Tov, everyone.